So I'm here. I am human just as everyone is, and I am here to admit that I made a mistake. Like, I made an error, a huge error. In my excitement, I acted out of impulse. I was just too excited about the information that I just acquired. And I put out an episode and named it The Anunnaki in Africa. Like, we had found a piece of ourselves that was believed to have been in a different world or a different part of the world that seemed to be detracted from us as like here in Africa, but it's a piece of our history. It's a piece of our heritage as well, because as we know that civilization started here in Africa and expanded and moved out into different parts of the world and each part formed its own cultures, each part formed its own beliefs, spirituality, institutions, and they came up with their own histories, but most of it was derived from home meaning Africa. And the Sumerian story, the Anunnaki story, is part of African story as well, African history. And I made an error. There's an old adage or an old African proverb that says, "Man, know thyself, and to thine own self be true." And I would be going against every fiber in my body if I did not go back and correct my error. So, welcome to the podcast. I'm your host, Bands, and you are the humans. This is another episode of Free Rants. And basically, I'm just here to tell you guys about the error that I made. So, in the episode that I've just mentioned, I spoke about Michael Tellinger, the South African author, white man, discovering the tomb of Dumuzi in Mpumalanga. And the place he calls it Adam's Calendar, right? But how I would be repeating the same mistakes that were historically made by archaeologists or historians, but I wouldn't even say mistakes because it was calculated in order to shift a certain narrative or create a certain narrative around the Western world and how they were molding their own paradigms and their own vision for the world. So they would, whatever they took or found, they would claim as their own, so that they could enrich their own history and take away from a different aspect of another place. So with this discovery, or I don't even want to say discovery because it was a science, or it was a history that was already being explored by Africans. And by Africans, I am talking about the great Vusamazulu Credo Mutwa. Everyone knows, I'm sure, Credo Mutwa by now. He's been spoken about quite largely over the past few days. There was a documentary that was released, and if you guys haven't seen it, please go check it out. I mean, what a tortured soul, but what a beautiful soul. And for him to go through what he went through, knowing what he knows, and being gifted the way he is, it's heartbreaking, And for people who come from outside of our sphere, in terms of like countries or even continents, people coming from Europe to come speak to Bab Credo and hear what he has to say, and then go over to Europe and not credit him the way that he is deserving of being accredited for the wisdom and information that he has. So Michael Tellinger pretty much did the same thing. He went out and almost sort of claimed the discovery that he made in Mpumalanga as his own, when Ubab Credo had already found the place. Not even found, like he had already explored and explained everything about the place, even gave it a name. He gave it the name Inzalo Yelanga, which means the birthplace of the sun, which makes sense because Mpumalanga is in the east and sunrise is in the east. So how does one go and claim it's like Columbus discovering America? How do you discover a place when there's people living there already? History is so funny. I mean, so I have to go back and correct that era and, credit Ubab Credo for his wisdom, his being, his essence, and who he is and what he means to us as a people. Inzalo Elanga, Adam's calendar, was already long been found, long been explored, and it's just that we don't document. As Africans, we need to invest in documenting our discoveries. We need to invest in documenting our inventions. We need to, because we live in a world now that if you don't facilitate the way that the system needs or the way that the institutions need, then you pretty much fall out of any sort of accreditation, because now it's like if someone came along and wrote about Inzalo Elanga and called it Adam's calendar, then they get the credit instead of the person who was actually invested their whole lifetime towards this place. So I don't know if Michael Tillinger did it intentionally or had any malice in his endeavors, but he has to, if it's in his heart, he has to come back and talk about this thing from the point of him learning all this information from Bab Credo. It's so important, and I know he's a South African as well, so it's so important for him to come back, just as I have. You have to be able to humble yourself to a point where you can be wrong. We're human. Like, at the end of the day, we're human beings, and we make mistakes, we make errors. And part of mine was being too excited. I got too excited about the discovery. I'm like, oh snap, the Anunnaki were here in Africa, and there's actually proof. Let's put this episode out, and that was just me. But for the most part, I came back to pretty much just state the fact that I made an error, I made a mistake, and this is me coming forth with, being vulnerable. Like, you have to be able to be vulnerable in our errors, and we move forward, we grow, we learn. As the old adage says, man, know thyself, and to thy known self be true. Once you know yourself and once you know something, you have to be true to that thing. Because if you didn't know before, then ignorance is bliss. You kind of get a pass because you didn't know anything. But yeah, that's all I have to say about that and that discovery regarding Michael Tillinger, Credo Mutwa. This has been Bands and the Humans podcast. I'm your host, Bands, and you are the humans. Peace.